sports business is evolving fast, and so is this podcast. After nearly 200 episodes as a revenue above replacement podcast, we're turning a new page and have some exciting things to announce. In this episode, we'll pull back the curtain on what's changing, what's staying the same, and why we're doubling down on some of the most important conversations happening in sports right now. Real estate, mixed-use development, community impact, and the global forces reshaping how cities think about sports, and an anchor for how people live, work, and play. If you've been with us from the beginning, thank you for taking a ride with us. If you're new, you picked a great time to start listening. I'm Brice Clinton, and this is the Roar Podcast. Welcome to the Roar Podcast. I'm Brice Clinton.
I'm Adam Grossman.
And I'm Caroline Valvardi.
Longtime listeners of the podcast will notice there's some things that are different today. Not only do we have a different name, but we have another co-host joining us. And Adam and I are both so excited to welcome Caroline, and we'll let her talk about her great career and what she's going to bring to the podcast shortly. But Adam, as we get going, let's tell the listeners some of these changes that are going on with the podcast.
Want to echo welcoming Caroline to the podcast. We're going to learn more about her. It's excited to have her on as a co-host. Part of the reason we brought Caroline on as a co-host is some of the topics that we're going to explore are in Caroline's expertise and her background and expertise and what she brings to the table. In particular, with the Roar podcast, part of the name change reflects part of at least my personal journey from Roar being acquired by Surge to taking more of a real estate focus. We're still going to be talking about data, analytics, artificial intelligence, the sports business, what we would look at from a student perspective, but we are going to more dive into real estate topics and how real estate impacts sports and mixed use development. And I think that's a perfect way to actually officially welcome Caroline and have Caroline tell a little bit more about her background.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me on the podcast. Super excited to join you both now that you're, I think, 200 plus episodes deep into this thing. 4 or 5 years, I guess. So very impressive run you've had, and excited to help bring some new elements and refresh and just kind of expand some of the content. And I really appreciate the opportunity to join you guys. So just a little bit of background about me and what I'm excited to help bring to some of the conversation. I at Surge focus mostly on public affairs, strategic communications, and then also help lead a lot of our business development, and have spent most of my background in community development finance. And so helping to invest in areas that are in need of investment, particularly around small businesses and affordable housing and community facilities. And with that, I've also worked in sports in different capacities throughout my career. So I've done some work in the youth sports space and with athletes on the sports philanthropy side, and helping them kind of figure out where to put their philanthropic and charitable energies. And through that experience, kind of the sports combined with the community development, I just realized there's this huge opportunity to leverage. As we all know, sports has this incredible power on so many levels, but a lot of power to really do good in the world. And so for me, that's my personal interest, is how do you leverage these sports, and particularly as the podcast will go deeper now into kind of the real estate side and these mixed use sports and entertainment districts that Surge is very focused on globally. How can you leverage those for greater economic impact and social impact that benefits, all stakeholders and not just, the sports team? And super excited to bring more of those lenses to the podcast. And, in my role, also a big part of what we do is focused on public-private partnership. And so there's this huge intersection between the private sector and the public sector, and how kind of all these trying to meet all these different stakeholder interests and needs through all these projects. So super dynamic and interesting. And so yeah, we'll get very deep into all those topics, and very excited to join you both and bring some more color to some of that. So thank you.
Yeah, I think one of the things we want to focus on, and as part of our new Roar podcast, is having more conversations, and particularly conversations with people as they're experiencing these opportunities in real time. Caroline and the Surge team, which I am a part of, is Surge stands for Sports and Entertainment Real Estate Global Holding. So we're working on projects throughout the world. We're working on the impact that those projects can have on local communities, as Caroline mentioned. And we're also actively involved in looking at these projects right now, and having conversations with senior leaders is something we've always had, but making those real time, making those as they're happening in the moment, and seeing, so our listeners can get a first look into what we're seeing and what we're thinking about, I think is a unique thing that we've tried to do historically, but now with Caroline on board, the Surge team on board, and the ability to really talk about something that is, if not at the forefront, one of the two elements at the forefront of the sports industry and what they're thinking about outside of, well, I would say outside of artificial intelligence and real estate, mixed use developments, and how that impacts teams, leagues, events, athletes, communities, and all the things that Caroline mentioned. So we're excited to have those conversations as well.
And Adam, you mentioned artificial intelligence. We've talked a lot about that on this podcast. I think for the power dorks that listen to us, we won't completely go away from that. But with you coming into Surge, a big part of what you brought to Surge was a lot of these things from a data and analytics perspective. Can you talk about that intersection and then how we'll cover that going forward?
Yeah, I mean, it's really about how can data help drive better outcomes for these developments. Outcomes can mean a lot of different things. From our perspective, that can be financial outcome. One of the reasons we're so excited with Caroline being here is the community outcomes and the community benefits and how this impacts all the different stakeholders that are involved in the community perspective. Caroline spent her career doing that, and that's something that she obviously continually will do at Surge. And I think that's, one of the questions about these developments is, and one of the things Caroline was actively involved in this week, is what is the benefit of the community of these developments? And since Caroline was actively involved with it, I want Caroline, this is exactly what we're talking about. Why don't we talk about what you were talking about this week in terms of some of the things that you were working?
Sure. So yeah, we have a whole multitude of projects at Surge that we're working on, and we launched just a little over a year ago. So we're getting very close to being able to speak about them publicly from in the comms side of my role and hat that I wear. I'm very excited to be able to start talking about them. But at the current moment, yeah, talking about them kind of in a confidential sense, but really getting deeper into some of these public-private partnerships, and they're very large scale, very complex, and many stakeholders. And so they already, some of these development projects, take time, but it takes even, more time just to get people aligned and on the same page. And so that's, I think, a really fascinating and also very challenging part of when you're doing these mixed use developments, and particularly the sports anchored ones where, you have all these different entities. You have the sports team, but even within the sports team, you have the executives, but you also have the ownership groups, and making sure they're aligned on how they want to participate in the district and what they want it to look like and how big they want it to look like and how much money they want to invest in it. And then liaising with the public side and what is the appetite and the recognition from the public side of how impactful the project can be. And so one really interesting element and that's why I'm attracted to this work at this time, is historically, it's always controversial. You are going, when you're building a stadium or arena, it's often can have disruption for people in that area. And it's like, how is everyone in that who's already living in that area going to benefit, and the local businesses that are already established in that area, how can they participate in all these things? So there's always some of those questions, but now it's a whole new ball game, pardon the pun, but where I know Adam loves dad jokes. Now it's a new ball game, as in it's not just a stadium or arena anymore. And so that's something I think, helping public side, just public in general, when they're learning about these projects, but also public officials when they're making decisions, helping them realize what these sports and entertainment districts can do. And, we all know about how powerful sports are, again, on so many levels. So, there's the power for good, but there's also the power from the money and influence side of all of these, team owners, and the amount of money just flows through the sports business. And so it's interesting. We're having a lot of times cities and governments, and particularly when we talk about globally, coming to us even before a team is coming to us to say they want to figure out how to do one of these projects, because they see the benefit of, again, it's not just a stadium or arena anymore. It's the whole area around where you're building a lot. I mean, in our case with Surge, a majority housing. So we're putting a ton of new housing in these areas, and then pairing that with the retail and hospitality and hotels and additional entertainment venues and public infrastructure and public spaces, and trying to make it this really integrated and live, work, play, shop, visit, add any other verb that you want to make it both a community but also a destination. So you're having all of these visitors come in, seeing it as a destination, and so all of these have tax streams associated with them. So there's the property tax values go up, and then there's sales tax, and on and on and on. So all these additional tax streams. So that's building up the tax revenue impact. And then because these are long-term permanent communities that we're building, there's also they're not just temporary jobs just for the construction. It's like these are long-term permanent jobs. And so anyway, all of that's very attractive to the public side. And so, but at the same time, there's just, when you're working with all these different stakeholders, like you need to make sure that a project is financially viable. There's a lot of challenges today as costs are going up for everything from labor and, et cetera, and all the, federal policies and things like that impact how, the expense of some of these projects. And so you got to balance that with how do we make sure that, we are putting mechanisms in place to ensure that the economic benefit of these projects is channeled intentionally to, an entire community and not just, a small subset of the, people at the top. So anyway, that might have been a little long-winded than what you were expecting, Adam, but that's, I could go on, but we'll have many more future. Yeah.
But I think that's the idea, right? I mean, all the things you just talked about are all different areas. But the idea is, that jokes aside, and obviously, even in this space, the white paper that I authored is called Team Building because I thought it was a clever pun, and I think my wife disagrees with that, and so does people who I originally wrote that for, but I thought it was pretty clever. But I mean, I think this is just the complexity of the sports business is, real estate or otherwise, is something that Brice and I have, obviously tried to explore previously with, Brice, you mentioned it obviously with artificial intelligence, real estate. These are things that are top of mind. They're very complex. We have access, through our networks, either through the Northwestern network, the Surge network, the Roar network, to people who are actively addressing these subjects, and that's what we want to focus on.
I think the other thing too that's really interesting is you've talked about it from Surge's perspective, having a much more global view and a global perspective. I think that'll be a really interesting facet to bring into the podcast because you guys are doing so many great things, not only in North America, but in other places. And sports itself is continuing to grow in those places as well. And so having the conversations around the global element of sports will be really interesting.
Yeah, and I think from our perspective, that's exactly right. Like, global is important. I think I wanted to, Caroline mentioned it directly in what she said. The fact that governments and sovereigns and folks are coming to us because this is specifically an issue that's really important and top of mind from the public sector. In particular, our founder and CEO, John Passatelli, he talks about this concept of disposable time. The rise of artificial intelligence will create more leisure time and more time for people to explore different activities. And what are people going to do with that time? Developing communities around sports and entertainment, which have historically been the case through community building, has been really important, leveraging sports and entertainment. That is going to increasingly be the case in sports and entertainment. Caroline mentioned this in her initial, what she was talking about, what she's looking at and focused on is what are you going to do with those times? Live, work, shop, play, developing community engagement, creating places where people can interact is something that artificial intelligence, weirdly allows for because there's more time, there's more and potentially more time, more energy, and hopefully for all of us, more income that can go towards these having these shared experiences. And that's what we're really trying to facilitate. And I know that's something Caroline and our team thinks about a lot when we're thinking about these developments.
Yeah. I was going to add to, I think the convergence to some of these. I mean, there's this also kind of a dual other trend in addition to the mixed use sports entertainment district development, which is, I mean, this is probably a driver of that too, is the rise in global sporting events too. And so that continues to grow in sports tourism. And so that a lot of those kind of thoughts go into how, making these mixed use sports entertainment districts a destination so that, that locality can, host these large scale events. But at the same time, the whole point of the mixed use districts is also how do you create them so that it's not just on event day that they're, active. And hence going back to, I like to make the point that these are not just fan zones and that they are places that are, people are living, working, and playing. So people really understand it's not even off of game day. It's like that's almost like a side factor that, there's a stadium or arena there. It's like this is where people are living and going to the grocery store and, doing shopping and things like that, even when, there's no events going on. And so yes, you're gonna have a steady stream of events and you want to have more events so that you have people always coming in and, having that economic activity, but at the same time, also just outside of that, having kind of a vibrant community that has places that people can convene and have shared experience and do all those things even when there's not events going on. So yeah, it's kind of interesting, just all the elements and all the things we think about when we're working with our partners to design and develop.
Yeah, I mean, the batteries is often used as an example because it's a publicly, the Battery, just as context, had the Braves roughly had 3 million people come to Truist Park, roughly 10 million people come to the Batteries. At minimum, there are 7 million other people who are coming to the Battery because there's it's a 365-day per year activated event. And the Battery financially has been very successful for the Braves, but also just in terms of this idea of where can people go, right? Where are people going to go? Where can people come to? Why would people want to come here? Because of, whether it's office space, retail, commercial, and entertainment, food and beverage, there's a lot of opportunity there. And that's something, again, that we have unique access to, and we'll be able to talk to people directly who are working on this. We had Adam Zimmerman on the podcast previously. It was a senior executive at the Braves, but this is something that is top of mind for every single sports executive. But it's not just sports executive; it's community leaders, it's government officials. It's something that we're just excited to really explore in more depth. And, one of the things, just going back to your original question, Brice, about global in nature, the entire search team, some of our team is based globally, but B, we're interacting with global leaders on a frequent basis and being able to talk to them directly about what their thoughts can, about sports and about real estate, but also about other things that they're thinking about in terms of technological disruption. We're not going to necessarily get into current events, like from a political perspective, that does have a ripple effect on some of the stuff that we're talking about as well. And I think having access to those leaders will be a really interesting addition to the podcast as well.
Yeah, completely. I've learned so much. I think Adam mentioned the white paper that he wrote with Clutch and RBC. That for me was really,
Yeah, flattery will.
I have learned that. Over 200 episodes, I've learned that. But I think that going back to that, though, I have learned so much from it. And I think that was when it was a real shift for me to understand these spaces. And what's really interesting to me is that in all the discussions that Adam and I've had and all the guests that we've had, one thing that seems almost counterintuitive is we talk about AI and the use of that, not only in helping to craft these spaces and continue to mold them, but Adam mentioned giving us more time. But then there's a convergence, too, of people wanting more in real life experiences, being in real space with people. And I think that you see that. You certainly see it when you get out in the community, especially around sporting events. And I think that Surge does a great job of piggybacking on top of that and knowing those things. I think that's something that we can all talk about in different angles going forward on the podcast, not only between ourselves, but with guests.
Yeah, well, I think you might need to tell us. You're kind of going to be in the sports capital of the world, Indianapolis, starting with the Final Four and the Indy 500. So you got to tell us what's going on there.
What's interesting is that Indianapolis is a pretty good use case in creating community around sports. And I often complain about living here and moving here. That often comes because I miss Chicago.
I mean, we had Joey Graziano from the Pacers Sports Entertainment. Hopefully he's not listening to that part.
I know. I feel bad because it was such a great episode. Joey is such a great guy. He's does an amazing job with both the Pacers and the Fever. The Fever are building a new sports performance center downtown. Because of that, there's additional hotels that are going up. The convention center is being expanded. You mentioned the race. The race is not only happening in May, but Ray Hall Ledman Racing is right down the street from my house. And all those things happening here. Indianapolis is a really good model for those things. Is there a sports anchored mixed use development in the city? No, but it's a city that really centers around sports in a lot of ways. And
maybe not yet.
That's a really good point. Not yet. It would be a place that it would work really well because a city like Indianapolis the community has embraced those things. And I think it's really cool to see the work that you all do to try to create those spaces in different areas, because we've talked about this before. And I mentioned that Adam really changed my mind about this was I was thinking about that third space in life where, you have work and school. Well, what we're talking about here isn't a third space. It can be all of those. It can be your work, where you live, and all of these things that you do to engage in a third space type thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something and Caroline, definitely want to get your perspective, right? The idea of the third space or, sports and entertainment anchors in these communities, some of that, there's been a question of whether, I think we talked about this a little bit before, but whether the third space, coffee houses and Starbucks, that's how it came. One of the reasons Starbucks became what it became is because it served as a third place. And with COVID and, you mentioned obviously the increase in real life experiences, there's so many more opportunities to create spaces where people will go and congregate. And a popular term, and I know this is better than I do, is placemaking. And like, how do you make places, whether it's your initial space, we're obviously looking at it as this is where you live, this is where you work. So the first, second, and third space will happen within the mixed use developments, but creating more spaces, whether it's and there's also a convergence. John talks a lot about this, and Caroline, obviously feel free to jump in, but the idea of the office becoming more of like your living room versus the living room becoming more like obviously a place where you work. So there's kind of this overlap and this convergence, and that's where we're operating this.
Yeah, I think some of the coolest parts about these projects and is you have to like get up to speed again with does mixed use sports and entertainment district really mean? And I think a couple key elements in my mind, and when we talk about from the public private partnership side and public infrastructure, and these are really can be and should be more so civic infrastructure projects. And so I think one element that, to all the public's benefit is, enhanced transportation and, those projects where we're trying to improve kind of the downtown city grid and increase traffic flows and add multimodal transportation. And, some of that also plays into environmental factors. So there's more people being able to, bike to some of these sites and making them more accessible and adding, there's plenty of projects where there's conversations and, execution of new subway or metro stops, right by that sports and entertainment district to allow more, people to be able to experience and access it. So it's not, just, the point is not to make it just a place for, people who can afford to live in the sports and entertainment district. Like the idea is, you want more people coming there because again, that feeds into the economic activity that we want there and, making sure again, that it's not just game day. And so anyway, yeah, I think transportation enhancement and, the increase in accessibility and overall civic infrastructure is very powerful piece of this and why these projects can be incredibly impactful for, the larger community when, things are kind of done right between all the parties. So that's, I think, a, cool element too, just to highlight.
It is cool. And I mean, I think what's cool for me too is Adam and I, over almost 200 episodes, have kind of gotten a cadence of our guests, of people that we have on, people we talk to. I do have a soft spot for that overlap of tech nerd and sports aficionado. Adam obviously has a wide range of those things, not only from a media perspective, but also the technology and the data and analytics, but the real estate components of it. And Caroline, I'm excited to see what guests you bring, but if you're looking forward to that, who are you hoping to talk to? What type of guests are you hoping to bring and have conversations with?
Yeah, I mean, obviously one a little bit more on the kind of public affairs side. And, I think a lot of the conversation, because the perspective from someone looking at it from kind of the public official or, city government or things like that. Like, and even some of those, folks are still working for a sports team, but like some of those nuances and perspectives of how you work with a city to get deals done and the government side. So I think that will be an interesting element because it's such a huge piece now of I mean, pretty much all of these projects, have some public-private partnership component if they're going to be feasible. And so knowing how to navigate those is really important. So I think those perspectives and what's needed, because I do find in sports a lot, it's kind of this higher level or a little bit more generalized, like, oh, I think there's genuinely this interest in providing positive community benefit, but sometimes they can be a little bit surface level and like how do you really deeper, like really make real community impact and what does that actually look like in the, when you're negotiating and community benefits agreements and all that kind of stuff. So I think that would be interesting. And then I think also I know you've had plenty of athletes spread on the podcast before, but bringing in some more of those perspectives from the athlete side, because it's interesting when you're in kind of the business of sports. A lot of times it's more kind of team and league level and other corporate perspectives. But I think hearing from actual players themselves who are literally in the game is often a very different type of perspective and how they view all of this and their intersection. And some of it is the intersection with real estate who may be involved in even, real estate development or community development. And that was again, back to what I was saying in the beginning is kind of, having done work on the athlete side and kind of the sports philanthropy space, it's been interesting to see how many athletes are becoming much more entrepreneurial and, running their own businesses and becoming very financially astute in how they manage their wealth and all that and creating generational wealth. But a piece of it too is I find a lot of athletes and, and you look at the whole women's sports space almost inherently has this kind of like social impact element to it. But at the same time, it's like, how do you, do well for yourself? And so this element of like impact investing. And I think that, some of those perspectives could be interesting. And again, just kind of the athlete perspective in general. So yeah, hope we get some of those types
Well,
of.
yeah, I mean, talk about I think where we really can separate and have separated this podcast and we'll continue to do that is this intersectionality. Like you just, Price, the way you frame the question is right. Like we have diverse interests. Even the company it serves as a whole is bringing together sports and real estate. where your operating brings together streaming and content distribution and content operations and bringing that together. Obviously, data, even for me, branching out as part of the acquisition of Roar by Surge into real estate, but leveraging data, artificial intelligence to impact real estate also in a sports context and leveraging those same tools to help maximize revenues from a sports perspective. I think just as intersection, a lot of times in sports, and I guess obviously you could say that in life in general, is people talk past each other because they're not necessarily understanding what somebody's saying, where they're coming from, or where those intersections exist. And that's, one of the things we hope to do on this podcast. Hopefully we've done to a certain extent before, but really now on a go forward basis, have conversations. Where are those intersections? Not talk past each other. Really say like, this is what we're interested in. What can you, not what do you know and what can you tell me, but like, or at least less threatening way than that. But like the idea, I think there's just a lot of people, a lot of people are interested in a variety of different topics. A lot of people I think are more, polymaths or interested in, and how do you bring these together? How do you talk about these things in ways that really, can be interesting and exciting and bring together these intersections because people operate at these intersections all the time. I don't think people stop to obviously the Ferris Bueller, you don't stop to look around once in a while. You should stop, look around, see where these intersections are and have those types of conversations.
You're right. I think that, go ahead, Caroline.
No, I was just going to say, I know you guys have talked about some of I think part of it was as having just getting some of the feedback from existing audience. And it sounds like they've been very receptive to kind of conversational style versus just kind of a back and forth Q&A type. So that's something that we'll be bringing. And I think
people like listening to Adam and I debate each other. We don't really even debate. We just kind of talk. And you're right. The conversation, even recording now and thinking about that shift, I think is a great thing because the conversational approach to it allows people to get their inside out more because it's not, hey, here's a question, answer that question.
Yeah, as much as we like being professors, not everybody likes being talked at. They like
that's true.
Hearing people, engage in actual dialogue.
Yeah, so I think, and just to that point of getting, I think ongoing, hearing people's feedback, what are they interested in, and that helps, kind of target what we talk about too, and finding the areas that people are most interested in, keeping audience in mind. And so I'm aware a lot of audience, obviously this is through Northwestern too, so it's a lot of students and, thinking about career paths and things like that. And I think also, the broad scope of topics that we talk about across sports also, I think is helpful, maybe helpful, but again, would love to hear feedback as we're starting this kind of new approach and adding new elements and topics and stuff. So it'll be interesting what resonates most and what is most interesting for folks to hear.
I think it's a great point because, well, Adam, you and I have always focused, obviously, from the listener base on that career path and the understanding of the career path. And you mentioned it, so much of that career path isn't as linear as it used to be. And the overlap in this, I think, is what's going to be really cool for people to see there's real estate components to sports. There's the financing component to it. There's a technology component to it. But they also overlap in a lot of ways. And when you're looking from a career perspective, if you can have an understanding of those things, it makes you more marketable and have a better understanding when you're looking to start that career.
Yeah, absolutely. All I was going to say, I totally agree with you. I'm not really that much insightful or interesting to add on top of that. But on a previous point, I think one thing we do, one thing I've tried to do, either for better or for worse, is to pursue some idiosyncratic topics that I'm interested in, which again, I think the podcast and the content allows for. And we definitely want listener feedback, audience feedback. That's very helpful. But we also want to be careful and balance that. Very famously, Henry Ford said, if people asked me what they wanted in the early 1900s, they would say they wanted a faster horse, not a car, right? Because people didn't know that cars existed. And part of the way you learn is by exploring, topics at these intersections and new topics and new ideas that we, hopefully will bring to the table that will be divergent than maybe other podcasts or other episodes. And I think this structure, because, having conversations around these idiosyncratic topics that hopefully will impact your career because they do provide new perspectives, but also are just interesting to listen about and hear about, is something we'll be able to explore actually way more with Caroline involved and bringing in things that, you and I are interested in, but maybe haven't explored them.
Totally. And I think that that's great because, as you mentioned, those idiosyncratic topics are fun sometimes. I think they're things that we were interested in. But like you said, the feedback is great and understanding the market space is great. But we also have some great voices, not only on the podcast, but the guests that we bring in that are experts in those spaces. And we want to be able to bring that insight to people. As I look forward to what's going to happen going forward from a podcast perspective, I think that's the thing that I'm most excited about, having Caroline be more regular host and having her guests and bringing in those different voices from what Adam and I had Adam and what he's doing now and continuing to learn and build on those things at Surge and bringing the new guests around that. And so I think for the two of you, when we look forward, what are those things that you're most excited about as we continue to get rolling?
Yeah, I think it is the new voices that I think Caroline's going to lead the efforts from the search side, but I think we're also going to bring in other people from the search team to not only be guests, but also host podcasts so we can continue to bring in new perspectives. And I think hopefully what the Roar podcast allows for is, again, different voices, different perspectives, and increasingly, not that not that there's anything wrong with Brice and myself, but, having different perspectives and different people bring in their points of view within this umbrella is going to be really interesting.
Yeah, I think similarly, it's just additional voices, additional stories to tell from, yeah, fresh set of content. I think, yeah, you always want kind of to create a core product that everyone loves and likes, but you always want to keep enhancing and switching it up a bit and make sure people don't get, keep it fresh. So I think that, and from my perspective, I'm the outsider coming in, so I'm very excited just to be part of it and, yeah, think about who I can interview and bring in that adds some of those different perspectives. And I do think like the global expansion piece of some of the content is hopefully will be very interesting to folks and diving in, because that literally opens up a whole world of conversations. And
Two,
I
we
know,
need a counter
yeah,
or a
like
bell.
dad jokes. So hopefully we'll bring more of those. So I'll get my little dad joke book out and make sure I have that handy. But yeah, no, I think it's gonna be fun. And yeah, just to kind of really echoing Adam, is just additional voices and different perspectives.
Yeah, all I would say is I don't think it'll be fun. I know it'll be fun, and hopefully we'll have fun, at least for 200 more episodes, if not more.
I agree. And I think logistically speaking, for the listeners, we'll still release on a week to week basis. You'll see a different name and you'll see some great new voices, but logistically, those things won't change. And so we'll keep continuing to get that content out there starting in the next few weeks. We got some great interviews that both Adam and Caroline have worked on to get set up, and we'll hear more from the Surge group and people inside of Surge. John, again, hopefully sometime soon. And so from a logistical perspective, nothing's going to change for listeners. We'll still be in your feed like we are typically. We'll see some great new branding that Caroline and her team has worked on. Well, we're excited for that. I'm extremely excited for that. And I appreciate the ability to work with all you folks.
Yeah, appreciate it as well. Looking forward to it.
Yes, likewise. Thank you.
So for the listeners, we'll be back with you soon again next week with more episodes. And again, thank you all for the help in getting this together and continuing to evolve the podcast.